All right, let's get started, guys. This week, we're following up on the last couple of weeks to do with goal setting and stuff like that. This one's about the art of saying no in situations where it might be a bit difficult to do so. And I'll address a bit of people pleasing and our reactions that may lead to wanting to do a bit more than we perhaps have the capability to do. And that'll link in a little bit with later sessions. Next week or the next couple of weeks will be on foundational stuff that we can do, like exercise, mindfulness, things like that, that are going to increase our baseline. We're at the first, like the second week that was on commanding your attention and techniques around that. And these are around setting goals and stuff like that. These are around setting ourselves up for the best chance to do what we want to do, regardless of what our baseline is. So we'll go through the self-compassionate way to review how your goals went. And look, it can be easy to kind of look at our goals, particularly if we've kind of gone into it with a pretty ambitious set of goals, or maybe we've said like, yep, I can, I should be able to do this or something like that. And to get away from that idea that if we don't achieve 100% of our goal, that we've failed, and to realize that progress is progress and we can do that without being so self-critical. We'll go through the curious mind approach as though we're researchers in looking back on ourselves as well, reviewing reasons why you might not have been perfect with your goals, and how to deal with a whole bunch of goals that you will have in life without getting caught into the kind of, I guess we call it a temptation for those of us who, if we're worried about not being able to maintain goals long term, or we're kind of thinking like, yes, I have it in me to kind of get on top of stuff now, but, we deep down don't know how long that's going to last, then we might want to throw on kind of all the things that we want to do all at once to be like, well, then I can at least have some amount of time where I'm doing all of these things. But it tends to be beneficial instead to focus on one at a time until we get to the point that we're, formed it into a routine, a pattern, something regular, and then we can stack on top of that without it becoming kind of the equivalent to the metaphor that I gave, I think last time, where it's like, trying to ride a bike, learn how to ride a bike. We want to first learn the muscle movements of learning to ride a bike, and then we can add extra complexities on top. And that same thing goes with our lifestyle and putting on goals that we want to do. All right, start your Pomodoro timers. And remember, guys, in general, because it's just a really good idea to remember this routine, it's around 25 minutes, not in session. It'll be kind of the amount of time that the slides allow, but it can be a really useful technique to get ourselves revved up. Reviewing goals and the curious mind approach. So imagine that the you reviewing your goals is a scientist assessing the results of an experiment. Like if you had done an experiment to see what was going to happen with, I don't know, imagine you had a water slide and you wanted to see how fast somebody goes down. Whatever it is, it's seeing something about the world and measuring it. That's what we want to think of ourselves as doing when we're setting goals for ourselves, with the idea that there is a set of circumstances that we can set up that will result in us actually completing that goal and doing it persistently. As long as we have that idea in mind, then we're really just looking at it as, okay, so I've set up a goal a certain amount of times per week or month or whatever it is that I'm going to do a certain thing, and I've set up certain reminders, all the stuff that we've kind of put into that. That's part of the experiment that we're placing on ourselves. And then we're the experimentee in doing that goal or doing whatever we happen to do. And when we look back on it, we should realize that, life happened in between. And just like anybody else, we adhered to that to some point. Our hypothesis, which hopefully is that we will do 100% of that goal, that will come true to a certain degree, depending on the situation, and the degree to which it comes true may change, and we can adjust it. And if we look at it like that, then it takes away that kind of sense of like, I should have done this, or I failed, or it should have been easier, or, X person over there was able to do it. Why wasn't I? All that kind of stuff. We're literally just kind of being like, I can set up a series of circumstances under which I will complete this. How close have I gotten? What deviation was there? And what does that mean that I should try next? So you hopefully created a situation for which the hypothesis was success. But now is the data gathering stage. As a scientist, you don't get tied up in whether this experiment matches your hypothesis. It's literally just testing. There is a situation, as I said, that you can create in which the you in the experiment completes the goal you set out, but it may take a bit of trial and error. And if the experiment was not in line with your hypothesis, what about the situation did not lend itself to your goal? And sometimes that'll be that extra stuff came up and whatnot, like we've talked about before. But we can have this kind of failure reaction. Most of us have had at least some terrible experiences of failure. And look, this leaves a mark. We'll be talking about it more in future weeks, but failure is the experience where no matter how well we happen to be doing, that we're given the impression that there's more left on the table, that we're not doing as well as we should or we could be doing. So this could happen, in school, for example, particularly like it is a very common thing for people who are diagnosed with ADHD, even later in life, to be able to look back at their report cards and see that they're often given this feedback that, if only they tried as hard as other kids, or that they're very smart, but they only apply themselves sometimes, because they see that the level of performance that we have is going to fluctuate from one day to another, which happens to depend on how engaged we are, particularly at a young age, how pulled into the material we are, which is going to depend on the material day to day that we're being taught and the gravitas with which it's being taught and stuff like that. Because our performance fluctuates like that, to a neurotypical person, they're going to kind of see that and be like, well, if they can achieve this level that they do sometimes, then that must be what they're generally able to do. So then why aren't they doing it those other times? And they would kind of put it down to like, maybe they're lazy or they're disengaged for whatever reason or something like that. But it'll generally come out in feedback of saying like that essentially there's more that we could do, which although is true given a different kind of set of circumstances, in a school environment where there's a syllabus, they're going to teach some stuff that's interesting to us and other stuff they're not necessarily going to teach in a way that we find foundationally interesting, then we're going to have that fluctuation in performance. And even if you're doing the best in your class, you're still likely to get that feedback of, if only you tried as hard as kids, or there's something more to do. And to us, as younger kids, if we get that feedback and then naturally we try to take it on, we try to do better, and then we're still not able to focus on those other times, then we feel like there's something inherently limited or bad about us that we're not able to change, and that we kind of get this impression of failure that we haven't lived up to our potential, even though we've done everything that we could to do that. And then we might kind of have ideas of like, well, if I'm either lazy or stupid, I'd rather be lazy. And then we might lean into that kind of stereotype. But down the track, if we have the expectation that at some point we may fail and we won't necessarily predict when it's going to happen, or we might not be able to circumvent that, then we can get kind of stuck into this idea that there's a sense of looming disaster, that it could happen, no matter if that has an emotional kind of grating on us, that it's like, well, I really don't want to end up feeling like that again. Especially if we've kind of done a lot of work in our career or what have you to work ourselves out of that, then when we get criticism or some kind of, ambiguous, I could say stimuli really generally, but like feedback or whatever it is, that, that we're not doing ideally, which is okay, because we, there's always got to be some way to learn from it. But like, if we get that, then we might take that as a sign of that may indicate that I'm failing and I really don't want to take that on. And we might kind of jump to ways of trying to get rid of that. We may also have a really kind of, unachievable expectation of ourselves for what success actually means, particularly if the things that we have trouble with seem to be the types of things that others don't have trouble with. And to be like, well, to be as good as them, I've got to be as good as them at the very things that they have strengths over my weaknesses, then we may not be able to measure up in that kind of way, and we may give ourselves unachievable goals, or goals that are mostly going to make us feel like crap because we're not going to meet them. There are different ways that we can come about that, and I'll play a video in just a moment as well with my own experiences, which actually comes from a 9th session of one of these groups in the past, just me answering a point that one of the clients in that group brought up. But it shows kind of my description of the type of what we could call complex trauma. So the results of unresolved traumas regarding failure is that we can have a disproportionate emotional reaction to any amount of failure, or discount partial success because failure is a more salient emotional trigger. Like if we had a plan to do something 4 days out of the last week and we did it 2 or 3 days, then we might take that as, well, I failed. I didn't do the amount that I should have done, that I gave myself. But realistically, if we compare that with not even setting the goal in the first place, where we probably would have done 0 or whatever we were doing as the baseline before we kind of started that goal, then we have moved closer to what we want to do long term. So when people talk about trauma in general, oftentimes, especially if they're referring to like PTSD, like post-traumatic stress disorder or something like that, they're talking about fear-based traumas, where particularly we've either experienced a situation in which we believed that we could or may die, like, that kind of thing, or similar circumstances of, seeing a lot of other people die or something like that, that indicates to us that we need to have like a higher kind of aversion, a higher sensitivity to risk and difficult situations like that, where we may actually, like, it's a fear response specifically. But then a trauma foundationally is about learning something about the world that isn't entirely generalizably accurate, where that ends up being dysfunctional or problematic in some way. So like if I have an experience where, let's say that I'd been mugged and I look back on that experience thinking I had no idea something like that could happen, and, I could have died during that experience. I start to see the world kind of through that lens of an extra dangerous place. And then I start reacting, like my starter reflex is going to go up. Well, like if you hear a car backfiring and you believe that you're generally safe, then you kind of, you're not going to like duck for cover as though it's an explosion. But, if you've experienced a war zone and that's really kind of in your mind as like, this is how dangerous things can get, and you hear that, then you might take it as something much more seriously. And there are a whole bunch of different, kind of ideas and like adrenaline responses and stuff like that that people with PTSD will have. And that's what we think of as kind of general trauma, where we're specifically looking at the fear reaction. But then there are a whole bunch of shame or failure, something like that, where it still changes our view about the world, ourselves in the world, and other people in the world, in terms of like, are other people safe or trustworthy? Is our kind of general world that we go through, is that a safe, reliable place, this kind of thing? It still changes our view of the world in a way that is not necessarily accurate and can be problematic in the way that we interact with it and see it, but it's not around the fear of death. So it could be if I'd had an experience of trying my very hardest to conquer some obstacle. Let's say that I'm a teenager and I had tried my hardest become accepted by groups of friends or something like that, and I had felt rejected by them. Then that experience could teach me that there's something about me that means that I won't fit in, which wouldn't be accurate, but would still be kind of understandable based on the experiences that I'd had potentially. And the way that I would interact with that, like I might stop reaching out, or I might instead be like, well, okay, well, they don't generally seem to accept me, but when I'm doing things for them, and this is where the people pleasing comes in, if I'm doing things for them, or like I'm giving them money or I'm giving them lollies or something like that, then they seem to be okay with hanging out with me. Then I'll be like, okay, so that's what I need to do all the time. And as long as I always do that, then I never get to prove to myself that people want to be my friends anyway. Complex traumas can be thought of as, from experiences we have, it changes the way that we see the world, including like ourselves, other people, the world in general, and the safety of it, in a way that's not accurate in general and is problematic in the way that it leads us to interact with things. That could be seen as complex trauma. Okay, so BPD, which for those who don't know stands for borderline personality disorder. To reach the full criteria of borderline personality disorder, people need to have had very disruptive experiences, particularly around attachment, in their ability to be accepted or feel accepted, and will often, in the case of borderline personality disorder, stem back to their primary caregivers, their family, but also be reinforced throughout their life. So the anxious ambivalent attachment style, where we could think of there as being kind of three main attachment styles, where you've got, secure attachment, anxious avoidant attachment, and anxious ambivalent attachment. Anxious ambivalent is when we're cared for or given acceptance, or shown acceptance intermittently. So like sometimes all good, other times not. And that can come from parents who are preoccupied in some way. They could be grieving. They could be, in a problematic relationship with drugs or something like that, where sometimes they're, totally available, or they seem it emotionally, and other times they're not. And this kind of push-pull gives us the impression of ourselves of like, well, there's the unpredictable nature of when can I trust people? What tells me that I can trust people, that they accept me, or that they like me, or what have you, and when can I not? Because our experience with their caregiver often is that sometimes they do, and sometimes they feel rejecting because they're not available. And then this experience gets reinforced over time if we're really sensitive to small signs of rejection, and that feels really hurtful to us, right? Then we're not going to make friends very well or retain friends very well. And over time, that reinforcement leads us to think that there is an inherent nature of people and connecting with people that means that they're untrustworthy, and the only way that we might come up with to meet our attachment needs, our needs for connection, are to manipulate them in some way, or almost like trick them into kind of being around. And that can be seen of particularly around attachment, but like a personality disorder that results from significant reinforcements of intermittent or poor attachment. Whereas a trauma around attachment can be far less severe than that, where, we could be overly worried potentially about people rejecting us, or people kind of, drifting away from us in a relationship or something like that. We might be quite reactive to that, but not to the point that it makes it extremely difficult to have relationships with people. Some aspects of the treatment, the useful treatment of BPD, can also be useful for people with ADHD. So Marsha Linehan was a psychologist and researcher who developed primarily DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, which was primarily originally for just people in general who had high rates of self-harm. And that ended up being developed particularly for people with BPD. Now, it's essentially a whole lot of strategies to understand how we can reason through situations where we might have a very strong emotional reaction leading us in a particular direction. That's been shown in research as well to be useful for people with ADHD, because we can have, a faster emotional reaction to something that may feel very strong in the moment, that those skills can help us to, digest and understand, and potentially have a reaction that more suits what we would have with a bit more time of consideration down the line. It's a little bit of a different situation than kind of teaching DBT to people with borderline personality disorder, because there's a lot more kind of building up of these foundations and convincing required in those cases. Whereas for us, like, people with ADHD will often, get upset or mad about something, and then later, like it could be half an hour later or something like that, depending on kind of what we get into after that, that we realize like, oh no, like that wasn't as bad as I thought, and we might apologize to our friends, for having snapped at them or something like that. Whereas generally for somebody with borderline personality disorder, if they feel rejected or slighted by someone, then they're not likely to believe that that's just fine 30 or 60 minutes later. That makes sense.
Okay.
So more building in that sense to get there.
Yep.
It can manifest in different ways. So I talked about how, like, trying to like reinforce this idea that I saw as the opposite of a failure. Like this was one way that I kind of tried to protect myself from that feeling of it. We might also do that by, like, sometimes people will say be studying and be like, well, if to underneath it all kind of want to be able to get to the point where they get their grades and be able to kind of look at that as like, yeah, but I didn't do this and I could have, and like I could have done better. So whatever it is, whatever that grade is, that, that doesn't represent me. So hopefully the feeling of failure that I may have from that won't hit as hard. Doesn't work very well, but we may do that. And we might also not try things, right? Or try to do things in a way, if we don't think that we can be consistent, as I said for a long period of time to like try to do a whole bunch of things all at once to give ourselves some chance of like, doing them all, but that ends up not leading to sustainability. So there are a bunch of ways that it can manifest. I actually sent an email to my supervisor who I mentioned during it that I had my master's, just kind of saying like, look, thanks for being patient with me. Because, I was diagnosed as an adult and I was diagnosed after I already had my master's. And like, yeah, there were definitely like useful points of feedback that he gave me that my first reaction was just to like essentially be like, oh yeah, no, I see where you're coming from, but da 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 da, all the reasons why I think that can be really frustrating. They don't want to let that sit, because of how that might make them feel. But like, most people are not aware of this. I certainly wasn't at the time. To be valued, people needed to see me as smart. So then that meant that, when I was engaging with them, that's what I was trying to put forward, which primarily is going to, like, if somebody doesn't feel as smart as you, then they're just going to feel kind of small by that impression you're giving. And otherwise they're just going to be like, well, why is this person telling me all of this? It's like, it would not lead to, good, sustainable friendships. It would lead sometimes to people kind of, maybe looking up to this idea that I'd made for myself, but then that didn't even validate me because I kind of had a sense that there was somewhat of a facade there. So even if they look up to that persona, then that doesn't lead to us feeling better about ourselves. It just leads to more kind of sense of like, well, if that's the only way that I can be validated, then I have to, give that impression to everyone. And it's a very unsustainable kind of cycle. They can be points where we like cringe kind of looking back, but we've got to realize that if there aren't points where we can look back on our own experiences and cringe, then we haven't grown. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
The only way for that to happen is that we've just stayed at the same baseline. So like, it's a good thing that we can look back. Like, I would think of like, you could be like, well, how long do I have to look back in my life to cringe? And probably the fewer years that is means the faster we're actually growing. Be like, well, if I can look back to a time 2 years ago and kind of cringe, then maybe that means that I've actually, matured substantially in the last couple of years. Like, this is all like, you have to make mistakes to get better, and life is all about making mistakes and trying stuff. And it also gives us the opportunity then to be like, well, maybe I could have learned more, or maybe I didn't need to do or like put myself out as however I was putting myself out in order to be liked and stuff like that. Maybe it can be easier. Alrighty, guys. So I know I went through this a bit last time, but just with this kind of curious mind approach, and I know that, for those of you who came up with a goal to look at a couple of weeks ago, and then just extended that into the last week, that it's a good time again to review it and to think about it from that standpoint of, did I have enough? What got in the way? If I wasn't 100% successful with the goal that I set out for myself, was it the one that I'm most cared about? Did I have enough time? Did I set the reminders? Did temporary things get in the way and the experiment should just be rerun? Did I forget to complete the goal? Was the goal too grand and it wasn't necessarily achievable, or was more kind of idealistic, or I should build to that? Was the goal not precise enough that I could be sure that I have done it or not? Did I get distracted when I tried, and could I set things up differently so that could happen differently? If we really look at this as though, we're kind of two different people. The experimenter coming up with and reviewing the goal, and the experimentee, where we're, adhering to the goal or everything that we do in between. If we were two different people and we weren't kind of getting into how we might judge ourselves in particular, then we would just kind of think through these things and be right. So like, what of these things could I shift so that it'd be more likely that this experimentee would entirely complete the goal or would get closer to it? Should I tweak the goal? Should I tweak the time that it was done? All that kind of stuff. And it's a different way of thinking of it when we're not getting caught into, I should have done that, it should have been easy, all that kind of stuff that we might tell ourselves. So dealing with multiple goals. So of course, in reality, we care about more than one thing. So how best to get a hold of a bunch of things all at once? Now, the reason why I kind of had this slide is because we often will come up with like a default answer for this, which is like, well, yeah, I'm just going to do them all at once, right? But what we want to do is like, if we try 5 things at once, our likelihood of committing any of them, like more than 0 of those 5 to become habits, is less than if we just came up with 1. But if we come up with 1 and then we get that to the point that it's regular, and then put something else on it, then our likelihood through doing that to reach 2, 3, 4, 5 is maximized. And that's what we want to do. We want to resist the temptation to go with a whole bunch of goals all at once, and instead to rein it back in, to be like, how can I set this up so that I have the highest chance to make progress that I can see and be sure is progress? Because anytime that we see that, we're going to get more confident, and our capability to keep on doing it will grow. And the longer we do it, the less we have to think about, actually doing it to keep it going. And the more we can then add stuff on top of it without that getting in the way of the primary goal. So form new habits one by one. Schedules are a great idea, but schedule alarms because we lose track of time. Use prompts to open the schedule until it's a habit. Balance things you want to have done with things you actually want to do. And what I mean by things I want to have done, I want to have done, all my admin work, but I don't want to go and do some admin work right now, and there may not ever be a time where I'm like, I really want to do some admin work. So that's the difference I'm talking about. Things that we find important to have done versus things that we actually, get enjoyment from doing in the moment. So let's say if the goal is to do yoga for half an hour, 3 days a week in the morning, to actually set reminders, or to have, some sort of alarm or something to make sure that we do it until it gets to the point that we're very, very unlikely to forget, if that makes sense. And even to go, over the point where we're like, yeah, I'm really sure that I'm going to keep on doing this. Now I can, stop the reminder, and I might look at bringing that back up later. And consider doing things, by the way, when it comes to setting up multiple goals that you want to do, consider doing things in a set order if you can. Like, let's say that every morning before you go to work, you always take a shower straight away when you get up, for example. Be like, okay, so that's something that's already a habit. I don't have to think about that. I do it every morning. I would feel weird if I didn't, kind of thing. We can build upon that, where if you start doing, let's say you wanted to go for a walk, or had a good breakfast, or something like that in the morning as well. You might do it directly after the showering or brushing your teeth or something like that that's already regular, because when you stack stuff in order like that, the thing that you do before it becomes associated with the new habit you're trying to build, and that pairing makes it easier to remember. Okay,